Well, I think Reagan benefited undoubtedly from a sort of sense of haplessness and ineffectuality that surrounded Carter by the end. I mean, the achievement on the Arab-Israeli treaty, on the Egyptian-Israeli treaty, was not fully appreciated, particularly at the time. The Israelis weren't overjoyed about it. There was, in fact, a great move for them. While he was seen in some ways to have lost Iran or been partly responsible for it, he hadn't been able to get the hostages back, despite making this the great cause of his final year. He said when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan that his views had been completely turned around, and so that made him look as if he really didn't have a good grasp of what was going on. Now, of course, Reagan was completely different to Carter in that Reagan never pretended to have a grasp of detail. That's not what he was known for. But he did seem to, A, offer a more positive message, B, not be trying to confront America with its malaise. I mean, malaise was a word that Carter used. You could never imagine Reagan using such a word about America. He always was sort of uplifting. He offered a clear message about American priorities and dealing with evil and so on. Interestingly, he was extraordinarily pragmatic and flexible over his presidency. And he wasn't by any means an unyielding ideologue when it came to the particular problems he faced. In some ways, Reagan, with the Iran-Contra affair, when he, having insisted he would never deal with countries like Iran when he was working, in fact, much more closely with the Iranians, tolerated an opening to Iran, which went against everything that he was saying. So actually, he dealt with issues probably more on a human and emotional level than on an ideological level in many areas of foreign policy. But he had the effect of making the Americans feel quite good about what they were doing. And I think also he had a great foreign policy achievement in a way you can almost say he broke the spirit of the Soviet Union as an opponent of the United States. And he did so in a way, in the end, that didn't rub the Soviet noses in it. In that, I think it was a genuine foreign policy success. On the Middle East, you can argue he went through some pretty big failures. But of course, by the end of his presidency, he could also say that he'd humiliated the Iranians too. He'd be partly responsible with Iraq for them failing to reach their objectives in the Iran-Iraq war. So the presidency didn't end with an aura of failure. If it had ended earlier, it might have done, but when it did actually end, it had an aura of success. Well, Reagan was the most pro-Israeli president, and after Carter, this was quite noticeable. The rest of his administration was not so pro-Israeli, and of course he came in when Begin, as prime minister, was taking a very strong line, both with the Palestinians and then in Lebanon as well, in the invasion of Lebanon in '82, to the point that Reagan got really cross with, surprisingly cross. And there were all sorts of problems during the '80s between Israel and the administration, though Reagan never lost his basically pro-Israeli approach. He didn't move the Arab-Israeli conflict on at all, really, only towards the end. And this was because of shifts really in the Palestinian position in the Intifada, when Schultz saw certain opportunities as Secretary of State to somehow draw the PLO into the negotiating process. But up to that point, not a lot happened. Of course, Israeli politics was paralyzed for much of the '80s, and that was the problem, because there was no clear-cut government. I think one of the problems that has beset American-Israeli relations, which people who were sort of always demanding of the Americans they put more pressure on Israel and so on, is just how weak in some ways a succession of Israeli governments have been. So though they may have had prime ministers or foreign ministers who saw the need to move the process forward. They never quite had the political strength to do so. And I don't think it was Reagan's particular interest to try to challenge that, as opposed to his successor, the elder Bush, if we can call him that, who did try to move it forward. The fact that Israel exists still is an achievement. It's a strong, vibrant economy. My sense is it probably will, but I suspect it'll be something very different, because I think states themselves will all be very different. It's really a question of what you think else is going to happen in the Middle East. There's a lot of failed states, not in the sense of collapsing in a heap failure, but just not doing for their people and for their economies what states should do. Syria, to some extent Iran, comes into that category. Most of the North African states, somewhere or other over the next few years, I don't think it's going to be Israel, there's going to be a major eruption in one of these states. This is not a stable part of the world, it's very volatile. So a lot of Israel's survival remains conditional on what happens elsewhere. There's a certain amount that Israel can do for itself. There's certain ways in which maybe it needs to sort of reach out and think of different ways of dealing with the Palestinians. Easier said than done. But a lot of the key decisions are going to be taken in other states. And though everybody's looking at Iran at the moment, the real trouble may come from somewhere else. So I think a lot of Israelis have got a sense of historical anxiety. They recognize that just being able to defend your borders or suppress in some way militants on the edge of your society is one thing, but rockets, long-range rockets, are another thing altogether. So there's an anxiety in Israel. I'm not sure they need to be that anxious, but they are. But in the end, it depends on the region, the wider region, sorting itself out. And this is a whole region of failures in many key respects. Israel is one of the more successful parts of it. So it's a regional challenge, which, if the progress is made, then Israel may be fine. But I don't think states are going to look the same in 100 years' time. So it may be a Jewish entity in that part of the world which is thriving and well looked after, but doesn't quite look like the state we see at the moment.